So the title of this session is Libertarian Impulses in Early Christianity and Contemporary Theology. I'm tempted to just dive right into the first century, but I think it would be best to get there by sharing the story behind this topic. Much of my story will sound familiar, and I suppose preach to the choir a little bit, but it's also a bit different. Usually when the topic of faith and politics comes up, the entire discussion is framed in terms of what Christians should do as Christians, how our theology informs our political decisions. That's a very common and a legitimate way of going about the subject. But that's not how I got here. It was actually the reverse. It's a case where the theologian stood corrected by the political philosopher on matters of both theology and politics. So I grew up on a farm and cattle ranch in southeastern South Dakota, and it was kind of a typical Midwestern neoconservative household. Conversations over supper revolved often around complaints about those terrible liberals in Washington. I listened to countless hours of Rush Limbaugh on the radio. It's not much else to do when you're stuck in a tractor for 10 hours. This is before the Tom Woods show and podcasting and so forth. Anyway, apparently made a mistake in mentioning Tom Woods there. Like any youngster, I defaulted to the views of my immediate surroundings. But time went on, and I experienced a couple of election cycles. Those on the political right were so happy that George Bush came to be our new president. Finally, a real conservative was in power. Now our dreams would come true, and the world would be at peace. Of course, nothing great really happened. More debt was accrued. Some countries were invaded, and the government bailed out banksters. The more and more I tried to pay attention politically, I was a political science minor in college at the time, at least initially, the more and more I started to question whether elections even mattered. It seemed evident that the big things, the structural things, the things that really counted probably wouldn't change. Before an election, people would call on the phone and actually say, "Have you voted yet?" Doesn't matter who you vote for, just go vote. This is the American thing to do. If this was the meaning of democracy, I wanted nothing to do with it. Somehow I eventually got my hands on some books by Ron Paul. His thesis that there is only one political party in Washington was horrifyingly and yet refreshingly true. Perhaps you've seen the meme that says, has the icons of both parties and says, in case you haven't figured it out yet, both parties will spy on you, will start illegal wars, are owned by banks, will continue the drug war, are slaves to corporations, continue the police state, and we could add a whole lot many more things. So this interpretation made a whole lot more sense than the popular alternative narratives. So this libertarianism thing was becoming rather attractive. It also appeared to be the only voice that gave any substantial weight to sound economics. Neoconservatives would talk about it, but they never really had the guts to do anything. The left wouldn't talk about it at all except in sentimental Robin Hood terms. The recent remarks by California's governor on minimum wage is an excellent example. He just came out and said it. Well, this law and these policies may not make any economic sense, but we're going to do it anyway because it makes us feel good. It gives the impression of being nice. Who needs economics? So the idea that price controls never work, the concept of real money that can't be printed at will, the idea that savings is good and selling bonds creates bondage, these basic kinds of ancient ideas didn't even seem to enter the dominant political thought process, at least to a significant degree. The debate always amounted to, well, should we run the country into the ground fast or sort of fast? And, should we raise income taxes or lower income taxes? Never mind that no one paid income taxes till 1913, a temporary tax, by the way, in case you didn't know, to help fund World War I. So then I got my hands dirty with Murray Rothbard, Andrew Napolitano, Tom Woods, and others, and I began to realize that libertarianism is not just about how government doesn't work. That's a given. That's obvious. The more basic idea is that violence is wrong. The initiation of force is wrong. Now, sadly, this struck me as profound. It was the first time I seriously considered that nonviolence is a virtue worth pursuing. And not only that, but it dawned on me that no other orientation could consistently pursue this virtue. Because in all the alternatives, the answer to the world's problems was always more laws. But more laws just means more force. Additional legislation is synonymous with the use of force. But that's the problem. Force is the opposite of freedom. As Rose Wilder wrote in the 1940s, government is a group of people who have a monopoly on the use of force. I was struck by this simple definition of government. It was weird and new, but I couldn't really reject it. And the implications were terribly startling. Imagine if a saleswoman for Toyota said, "We'll offer you our SUV for $50,000, but you can't decline our offer. Otherwise, we'll punish you." Well, this would be unthinkable. But a group of politicians have told us, "We're going to sell you court systems, interstate systems, national defense agencies, whatever else we decide by vote, food, cars, housing, education, in exchange for 40% of your income. If you decline our offer, we'll punish you." We've all been raised to think that that's okay. I have to wonder if it is. After all, having a monopoly on fighter jets, grenade launchers, and the most powerful armies in the world is a whole lot more serious than having a monopoly on cheeseburgers and toothpaste. Isn't it strange? Citizens are disturbed when one guy with a gun kills a bunch of innocent people all at once. But the same citizens are not even disturbed or discomforted when their own brothers and sisters in the military destroy entire villages in countries they've never even heard of. Or when a SWAT team accidentally kills toddlers searching an apartment for a plant. So the whole idea of peace opened my eyes to the culture of violence that we're all swimming in. And libertarians were some of the only people who could consistently condemn evil and call violence, violence. And then it hit me. That's what Christians are supposed to be doing. The basic principle of non-aggression is just as basic in Christian theology and ethics as it is in libertarian thought. How have I missed this? Because you really can't talk about the early church, the new covenant of grace, and certainly not Jesus of Nazareth without talking about peace. It's a formative, distinctive aspect of the entire Christian world and life view. Violence has no place in the kingdom of God. In fact, we should elaborate a bit on this, these libertarian impulses in early Christianity. Jesus was called, among other things, the Prince of Peace. And that's because he despised the use of force. He neither exercised force himself, encouraged others to, nor tried to take advantage of police and armies of any government. "Put away your sword," he rebukes his followers. And in the New Testament writings, we continually find a theme of voluntarism driving every aspect of church life. 2 Corinthians, Paul, when he's talking about giving, he says, "Where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom," continues to go on, "Give as you've made up your mind, not reluctantly or under compulsion." Peter says similar things, "I exhort the elders among you to tend the flock of God, not under compulsion, but willingly." So this theme of voluntarism permeates early Christian literature. And why is that? Well, it's because of this new covenant in Christ. The new covenant community, as Hebrews 8 through 12 argues, is not like the old covenant community. Racial, sexual, geographical lines are not drawn like they once were. Those who join God's people do so because they choose to. No more mandatory, collective, patriarchal, bloody circumcisions at birth as the covenant sign. Instead, there is faith-based, individual, voluntary, gender-inclusive, cleansing, baptisms, and nourishing meals at the Lord's table. You see, the signs of the covenant say something about the nature of the covenant. So the new covenant community that we typically call church is by nature a community founded on peace, voluntarism, and freedom within the liberating law of Christ. And that is a bit of a paradoxical phrase, isn't it? Just as when Paul says we are slaves of righteousness. That's the point. It's the gospel turns the typical way of thinking upside down and inside out. And many Christians maybe haven't got this yet because they're just so anxious to get people in the government so they can force everyone to do what they want. I'm sorry, but that's generally not a Christian attitude. Early Christianity was also known for non-aggression because Jesus endured aggression and embodied peace more than any other person. He was brutally murdered by the Romans, innocent of all crime, like a lamb led to the slaughter. It was really an unforgettable series of events, and it certainly was a contrast. In the words of one biblical scholar, quote, "The salvation of Rome was created by violence, while the salvation of God was displayed in his offer of reconciliation." The Christians claim that Jesus was Christ, the Jewish Messiah, as foretold by the First Testament prophets. And not only that, and it took a while for the disciples to really wrap their minds around this, as New Testament scholars will point out, but Jesus was also the incarnation of God. It's kind of like we're all characters in a video game and wondering, I wonder if we're in a video game. Is this a creation, in other words? Are we the highest intellectual form there is, or is there something more beyond this? And the architect of the video game chooses to be revealed, to act in the most vivid way possible, entering the simulation, taking on the form and flesh of a creature. After all, that's the only way people are really going to know, because to leave this simulation, this reality, only the higher life form can accommodate and come down. We can't leave. And so in a human body and person, this incarnate creator enters the world in mystery, breaks all kinds of rules to demonstrate transcendent power and sovereignty, walks on water, heals the lame, raises the dead, refutes some of the smartest intellectuals alive according to their own sources. And yes, this incarnation even speaks in our language and in a number of creative and baffling ways, telling us what true humanity is in that God is real. Hence, Jesus says, "I'm one with the Father, the originator of all of this. This kingdom is not of my world," and so on. And to top it all off, this incarnation has all of these catastrophic events and remarkable sayings recorded not by one, but four intertwining eyewitness accounts faithfully transmitted in the best-selling, most influential collection of writings ever composed. What more could creation ask for? If this is not sufficient for accepting the Christian story, then nothing will be sufficient. What is the highest form of epistemological certainty, of achieving the highest form of epistemological certainty? It's not academic consensus. It's not a new documentary. It's not a new YouTube video with lots of likes. And it's certainly not some guy wearing a gold crown or someone who won an election who just says, "This is absolute truth, now you all have to believe it." The height of epistemological certainty is when the creator of the universe becomes one of us and stands on this soil and looks us in the eyes and says, "This is my world. Follow me." That's as good as it's ever going to get. And so it's no wonder that the early followers worshiped Jesus, prayed to Jesus, sang songs about Jesus, stood in front of spears and in front of thousands in the theaters, and said, "Yeah, I do believe Jesus is God. What are you going to do, kill me? Haven't you heard? The grave is conquered. Jesus is Lord." And that, of course, is one of the earliest Christian confessions. And we've all heard it said, but it's more than meets the eye. Language obviously fails, and Christians tried to use all kinds of metaphors and analogies of getting the point across about what they were experiencing. They appealed to Greek philosophy and calling Jesus the Logos, this rational principle behind everything. They appealed to contemporary cultural idioms, to the world and symbolisms of Judaism, and on and on. But this brief phrase had to be sufficient for the time. Sufficient for what? Well, there were other so-called gods in the first century, many, in fact. So it was vital not to confuse the real, genuine incarnation of God with these impostors. And the greatest, most powerful man at the time, who was worshipped by the masses, just so happened to be the head of the government. And not just any government, but the great and almighty Roman Empire. Emperor, Caesar Augustus, all kinds of titles. And Caesar did at times claim divinity and demanded everyone's allegiance. Caesar was Lord, as the people said. So you can see then that saying Jesus is Lord is not only theological, but absolutely political. And it took quite a bit of bravery to say that. I mean, taking the highest icon and position of power and undermining it in 3 words. This put the church in a tough spot. On the one hand, Christians didn't just want to rebel and get completely crushed, because then who's there going to be to tell the story? As Michael Bird writes, quote, "Survival is one of the best forms of defiance," unquote. But on the other hand, there's no way that they're going to burn incense to the emperor. They know who God is. And they're also not going to worship any of the other approved gods. Today, the government has approved businesses, the approved war factories, the approved licensing boards, the approved accrediting agencies. It's the same thing in the first century. There was approved religions, and Christianity was not making it on that list, partly because it didn't fit any of the traditional categories. Imagine going to the officials and having them write it down on a form. Okay, so God became a human being through a virgin birth of a peasant lady, performed a bunch of miracles showing he's God, died at the hands of both the state and his own people, came back from the dead 3 days later, made breakfast, talked, and disappeared. Okay. So where does that fit in with Zeus? Where does that fit in with Artemis? Or my favorite, the god Priapus, who promises to penetrate you, man, woman, or child, if you steal food from his garden. Better watch your back. The Christians did not fit in. They did not fit in. And for that reason, Christians naturally took on the label of atheists. If you've read any of the early church fathers, you know that's one of the earliest misunderstandings of Christianity, was atheism. And since atheism was not acceptable, Christianity quickly became illegal. But breaking religious categories was hardly the biggest threat to the state. A big problem was this resurrection business. You see, Jesus' physical bodily resurrection typified the resurrection of all his faithful followers. And as New Testament scholars have shown, bodily resurrection of the dead was not a very common belief or idea by all those living in the first century. In fact, Jesus' own followers, Jewish and Gentile, didn't buy into his resurrection at first. They refused to believe it. They had to be convinced, because dead people just don't come back to life. But now the church witnessed these things with their own eyes, and they began to realize, oh my goodness, there is a future, there is something beyond this. This was a theology that was and has always been threatening to the state apparatus. Because people who have hope beyond this life tend not to be very afraid of death. And if you're not afraid of death, the use of force loses its power. That's one of the reasons why the Sadducees, who didn't believe in a resurrection, were more favored by the Romans than the Pharisees. And so if this new sect of Christianity got everyone thinking that death didn't have the last word, the government's power was seriously threatened. Second of all, physical resurrection harkens back to prophecies about the Jews restoring their national independence. Resurrection at this metaphorical level, N.T. Wright notes, was always a revolutionary doctrine, because by means of the metaphor of revivifying corpses, it spoke of the concrete hope of national freedom. So the theology of resurrection in the first century was almost like a band performing, Stars and Stripes Forever or the Star-Spangled Banner in Great Britain, after the Revolution or something. Not very welcome. So you can see then that the belief in the resurrection was neither theologically nor politically correct. And when someone who was condemned and professionally killed by the state is said to come back to life, this is serious trouble. But ultimately, the whole culture and message of early Christianity was utterly at odds with the statism, hierarchy, and violence so characteristic of the period. Listen carefully to this excellent summary by Eastern Orthodox historian and philosopher David Bentley Hart in a book published by Yale University Press. Quote, "The new world we see being brought into being in the Gospels is one in which the whole grand cosmic architecture of prerogative, power, and immanence has been shaken and even superseded by a new, positively anarchic order. An order, that is, in which we see the glory of God revealed in a crucified slave, and in which, consequently, we are enjoined to see the forsaken of the earth as the very children of God. In this shockingly, ludicrously disordered order, so to speak, even in the mockery visited on Christ, turns these things upside down. It's not Christ's ambitions that are laughable, but those emblems of earthly authority whose travesties have been draped over his shoulders and pressed into his scalp. We can now see with perfect poignancy the vanity of empires and kingdoms and the absurdity of men who wrap themselves in rags and adorn themselves with glittering gauds and promote themselves with preposterous titles and thereby claim license to rule over others." So he's talking about that scene where Jesus is getting mocked. "Hail, King of the Jews!" And of course, the question is, well, who's being mocked here? Who's the ones being shamed? So the so-called libertarian impulses in early Christianity is quite clear at this point. And if time allowed, we would discuss what happens when Christians foolishly try to harness the power of the state. Actually, Hart makes a good point on this matter in the same volume. He says, quote, "It has been the history of a constant struggle between the power of the gospel to alter and shape society and the power of the state to absorb every useful institution unto itself. Violence increased in proportion to the degree of sovereignty claimed by the state." Let me say that again. Violence increased in proportion to the degree of sovereignty claimed by the state. The reason this is so important is because, tragically, these are the kinds of observations, sinister and yet true as they are, that are not being taught to those young Christian leaders so anxious to run for office, grab the law by the horns, and change the world. Do you want to change the world for the better? Well, look to Christ. What did he do? You're probably going to be misunderstood, persecuted, betrayed, and labeled an enemy of the state. But that's what it might take. Welcome to the church. So we're going to have to skip over a couple thousand years at this point and look at where some of these ideas of libertarianism pop up in contemporary theology in the last 100 years or so. And I want to do this because supposedly libertarianism is a secular philosophy that has nothing to do with Christianity and Christian ideas. Grab a quick drink here. Consider a number of points made by Daniel Migliore, Charles Hodge Professor of Systematics at Princeton Theological Seminary. In one of the most popular theological texts today, I use it for my classes. Listen carefully, and this is a quote. "It is in a world captive to the law of violence that Jesus lived and died for us all. But God raised the crucified Jesus and made him the chief cornerstone of a new humanity that no longer espouses acts and systems of violence, that no longer needs scapegoats, that no longer wills to live at the expense of victims, that no longer imagines or worships a bloodthirsty God, that is no longer interested in legitimations of violence, but instead follows Jesus in the power of a new and Holy Spirit. Wow, couldn't have said it better. Earlier on, he says, the human freedom and maturity intended by God are destroyed both where one lords it over another and where one fails to resist being lorded over. That, of course, is the same point made in the Declaration of Independence. There's a responsibility to somehow challenge tyranny. Migliore writes elsewhere, true apostolic witness to the gospel eschews force, intimidation, and deception as strategies to win adherents, whether in the form of a blatant appeal for state power to secure the church's position and influence, or the more covert forms of threat and coercion. In summary, he says, God's grace is not coercive, but gives humanity time. The Methodist Arminian patristic scholar Thomas Oden can be found making a lot of the same points, some in his popular text, Classic Christianity. He also stresses this one point, quote, Jesus' messianic mission led not to a political kingdom, but to a crucifixion, not to living powerfully, but dying powerlessly. Well, how about those dirty, evil, baby-eating Calvinists? Surely those cold-hearted, puritanical heretic hunters have no problem with coercion and the use of force. Consider Herman Bavinck, arguably the greatest Reformed theologian since the Reformation. In his multi-volume work, Reformed Dogmatics, written around the year 1900, he just comes out and says it. Coercion is alien to the essence of God. Wow. He says the kingdom of Jesus is, quote, not a kingship of violence and weapons. It rules by word and spirit, by grace and truth, by justice and righteousness, unquote. Later on, Bavinck reiterates this point when talking about covenant theology. He says, quote, covenant honors the fact that God created men and women as rational moral beings. He treats us as such by not coercing us, but using persuasion. He wants us to freely and willingly serve him in love. Even in speaking of predestination, he says, quote, it is in this channel by which the stream of election flows toward eternity, Christ sends his Spirit to instruct and enable his own so that they consciously and voluntarily consent to this covenant, unquote. Yes, this is in a book called Reformed Dogmatics. And this is the same point, of course, I made earlier about the nature of the new covenant. The Reformed apologist and philosopher Douglas Groothuis of Denver Seminary says something similar regarding evangelism. Neither Jesus nor the apostles ever sanctioned coercion as a method for mission. Neither did the early church. We know from history that the church has sometimes used coercive power of the state to threaten or force conversions, yet we cannot find any basis for this strategy in the Bible itself. He's definitely not the first to make that observation. Well, how about more popular theologians, like Stanley Hauerwas of Duke Divinity School, professor of theological ethics? Well, this is easy. Hauerwas is known for his critique of religious legitimations of violence, and he's, if you've read his books, he's very humorous and witty and very fun to read. Here's just one snippet of countless, but it's very carefully worded. He says, the church is God's polity, whose greater character is peace, the tranquility of order. The church is a government that strives through the practice of the commandments to escape the libido dominandi, lust for domination, which requires as well as makes possible that the church forswear all coercion. Well, how about popular figures outside of academia? Consider Shane Claybourne, author of the best-selling book by Zondervan, The Irresistible Revolution. He provides a blistering critique of the American warfare state and what he calls redemptive violence. At one point he says, every life lost in Iraq, which he had traveled to and seen all this happen, is just as tragic as a life lost in New York or D.C. I don't think he realized it, but this remark is very similar to what St. Augustine said over 1,000 years ago, which is this: is it reasonable and wise to glory in the extent and greatness of the empire when you cannot point out that the happiness of people who are perpetually living amid the horrors of war, perpetually rolling in blood? Does it matter whether it is the blood of their fellow citizens or the blood of their enemies? It is still human blood, in people perpetually haunted by the bloody specter of fear and driven by murderous passions. Wow. In a completely different book by a Christian minister called Finding the Groove, Composing a Jazz-Shaped Faith, we find similar arguments. Nonviolence is the weapon of love. This method seeks to expose evil without harming the person perpetrating the evil. Its goal is to meet physical force with soul force. So if there was a person stinging your skin with a water hose when all you wanted to do was the right to vote, or if dogs were released to attack when all you wanted to do was use the same restroom as everybody else, retaliation was not an option. Nonviolence draws on the teachings of Jesus, unquote. Well, we could go on all day. We haven't even mentioned Karl Barth, Reinhold Niebuhr, or other towering figures of 20th century theology. But the basic point is that all of these ideas that we call libertarianism are readily found in today's theologies of all kinds and contexts. But of course, none of the people I cited would ever call themselves libertarians. In fact, I'm sure most of them are very offended that I just made this association. Why is this? Well, for the obvious reason that libertarians are a bunch of pot-smoking hippies from Colorado. Libertarians are a bunch of preppers from Wyoming gathering ammunition, calmly waiting for the zombie apocalypse. Libertarians are a bunch of 30-something unemployed white guys living in their parents' basement playing Call of Duty into the wee hours of the morning. Libertarians just complain about everything and have nothing positive and practical to contribute. It's all just pie-in-the-sky ideas. Does any of that sound familiar? Something a little bit. And let's not forget the charges of a popular Southern Baptist seminary president. Libertarians are more or less idolaters, foolishly saturated in selfish individualism and paving the way for godless secularism. This last one strikes me as a bit strange. When seminary presidents are horrified by a group of Christians whose sole concern is establishing peace and justice, I think there's a problem. This is a very important point to make, especially now, in a season where everyone from Dr. James Dobson, the president and board of Liberty Seminary, Wayne Grudem, and countless other Christian figures and their grandmothers are giving their public support to a presidential candidate who just can't wait to use force on the world. And of course, how much more strange when socialism and Marxism, ideologies responsible for the murder of over 50 million lives in the most violent century in human history, is viewed by Americans as being the generous, kind-hearted option. We are truly in a time of confusion. So, libertarianism has this obstacle of radical stereotypes. But most of the contemporary figures I cited really aren't libertarians because they don't consistently carry out what they're teaching, some of the things we looked at. In most cases, the state, the most dangerous monopoly of all, gets off the hook. A theologian will boldly proclaim that the kingdom of God is not political, doesn't exist through traditional means of power, is not a kingdom of violence, and then turn and tell us how important it is for Christians to get in positions of state power. On one page of a book, we're told that genuine relationships in community can't be forced. They have to be mutual and voluntary. But then on another page, we're told to support all anti-discrimination laws and forced business associations. On one page of Claybourne's work, for example, He'll criticize the state's military threats, and on another page, praise the state's threatening of businesses for not paying their employees enough. Hauerwas will talk about escaping the evils of capitalism and the evils of statism as if they are somehow comparable. As if a society of profit-making and having too many wealthy people is just as bad as mass starvation, gulags, and forced labor. Other theologians will criticize the intoxicating greed of corporate CEOs, while saying nothing of political greed. Biblical scholars and philosophers will point out the problems of totalization, hegemony, and the substitution of God for the state in modernism, but then pretend as if the mere passing of a law will bring a state of affairs to pass, just like God speaking the universe into existence in Genesis 1. So there are some serious inconsistencies going on. Now I want to conclude by observing a third and final obstacle for why Christians, and I know this is a snarky way of putting it, do not confess their libertarian theology or their libertarian political views. And this reason is also another inconsistency. It's the failure of current models of Christian political leadership. Christians are supposed to be known for the brave, courageous work of preventing wars and keeping peace. What are Christian congressional leaders actually known for? Generally speaking, I realize there's exceptions. Legitimizing wars and ensuring that when you are unreasonably searched and seized, the people violating your rights have the latest military technology. Christians are supposed to be known for caring for widows and orphans. What are professing Christian congressional leaders actually known for? Legitimizing the creation of hundreds of thousands of orphans and widows all over the world, wherever American soldiers can be found, especially in the Middle East, ironically, which is where the First Testament prophets made such a big deal out of these things. Christians are supposed to be known for financial prudence. What are Christian congressional leaders actually known for? Deficit spending like everyone else. Christians are supposed to be known for exposing systems of oppression that create and sustain poverty. What are Christian congressional leaders actually known for? Giving a free pass to monetary inflation, monopolized central banking, fractional reserve fraud and fake money, bailing out corrupt financial institutions, crony capitalism, and doing nothing to overturn the welfare state that both discourages churches from doing their job and enslaves millions of the poor to selfish politicians. Christians are supposed to be known for freedom. What are Christian congressional leaders actually known for? Passing one piece of legislation after another in the perpetually growing bureaucracy of federal nonsense. Nonsense that stifles creativity, discourages small business, and provides unfair advantages to a select group of corporate interests. So there are good reasons then why millennials like myself and others are uninterested in mainstream politics and disillusioned by the entire concept of civil leadership. In conclusion, libertarianism is a legitimate political and economic expression of sound Christian theology. In fact, it is probably the best such expression. It's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it's growing exponentially. I think this is hopeful. And being followers of Jesus that we are, or at least try to be, let us continue to spread some of this hope. Thank you.